Hello, Mark Ostwald from ADM Investor Services International. I'd like to share a few thoughts, first of all, on those stunningly weak US retail sales numbers that we had yesterday, and more importantly, on the outlook for Fed policy. So let's start off and get straight down to ground. Obviously, what we had yesterday was that minus 1.7 on the core measure of US retail sales. Had been very strong in the previous month, so perhaps one could see this as a bit of a correction to that inordinate strength that we had in November. But this really doesn't look quite right from the aspect that this minus 1.7 that we had for the delayed December data is the worst result that we've had since 9/11. Obviously 9/11 and where we are now in terms of shocks to the consumer are completely two different pairs of trousers. And it also doesn't really fit with the anecdotal evidence that we had. So remembering that this data is for December, let's look at the next chart, which is for the weekly Red Book sales numbers. Now, yes, in January, those have tailed off quite sharply. But as you can see, back at the end of December, which should basically give us a rough idea or some clues on the official retail sales numbers, we were actually at a very strong level, and indeed the retailer reports pointed in that direction. But let's leave that aside. It's a big week, or big 2 weeks for the Federal Reserve coming up. And this week we've had a couple of important pointers. People talking about a subject which we're probably not quite focused on enough, namely the Fed's balance sheet. The bulk of the market concentration at the moment is how long will the Fed pause? Is this actually the end game for US interest rates? But this week we started off with Mrs. Mester talking about a decision needing to be made on how the quantitative tightening program or balance sheet reduction program would shape up over the next year, and a decision will be made in the next couple of meetings. We've had Mr. Kaplan from the Dallas Fed talking about voicing the sentiment that he didn't think actually the quantitative tightening program had impacted the equity markets. That doesn't actually preclude him from saying we're going to wind down the QT program, but just that he doesn't want anything to do with markets involved as a rationale. And finally, we had Lael Brainard being even more specific and suggesting that she would like to see the program ended by the end of the year. So we're now left in this situation where we've got the FOMC minutes, where this was doubtless a topic of discussion at their January meeting. We have at the end of next week about 6 or 7 speakers, including Mr. Williams, Mr. Qualls, and Mr. Clarida, very senior Fed officials, talking at various conferences on quantitative measures of the economy and indeed the Fed's balance sheet. And so we should also get some more clues there. And then the week after, we will have Mr. Powell talking about doing his annual Humphrey Hawkins testimony. 3 things we need to think about on this front. Number one, what sort of, are they thinking about tapering? If they are thinking about tapering, it's going to clearly have to be at a much faster pace than they upped this one, because they added extra 10 billion every quarter, so that took 15 months. If we're going to end this by the end of 2019, then the taper will have to be more rapid. Secondly, and this is perhaps the key point, how does ending the quantitative tightening program fit with the US interest rate outlook? In other words, will the Fed couch this in terms of with some caution, i.e., will they say we will still be able to raise interest rates if we need to and we think it's justified after the current pause and we get a clearer picture on the economy? Or will they basically say that the two are actually quite closely allied? Those are very, very important points, because it really puts a relatively very dovish spin or less dovish spin.